Hi, today we are going to talk about imaginary and complex numbers. So this is our main thing. Square root of -1 is defined as I. What we need to understand here that this is not a real number. You don't have any real numbers that you can square to get a negative result. We call this an imaginary unit. And also one thing that I see a lot, and I want to make sure it's not something you're going to be confused with, I does not equal -1. This is very, very important. I is the square root of -1. So let's take a look at a few examples. How do you evaluate square root of -9? A standard approach for these problems is you're gonna write that as 9 times -1. Then using properties of square root, you can separate that into a product of two radicals. So what we have here, this gives us 3, this gives us I, and the answer is going to be 3i. Please again understand this is not a real number. Square root of -15. Okay, so we'll do the same thing. We're going to write 15 times -1. And we're going to separate that. Square root of 15 times square root of -1. So square root of 15, it's not a perfect square. We can simplify that. It's going to stay as square root of 15. This becomes I. Now, this is actually not incorrect if you write it like this, but to avoid any possibilities that accidentally somebody's going to stretch the square root sign a little bit too far, it can't do that. A standard way of writing expressions that contain the square root is putting I before the square root. So that will be a traditional way of writing the answer. Square root of -100. I think you should see the pattern by now. Correct. This gives us 10, this gives us I. The answer is 10i. So that's, I hope this is pretty easy. Alright, let's move on. The papers don't want to come apart. Alright, so with regards to the last problem, this is very important to understand. When we write 10i, that does not mean the number is positive, and -10i does not mean the number is negative. That's just a way to distinguish numbers. They do have their own meaning, but there's no positives and negatives related to imaginary numbers. Because when we talk about positive and negative numbers, that means we can compare them with 0. And numbers that are greater than 0 are positive, and the numbers that are less than 0 are negative. And you can't do it with numbers that are not real. You can only do it with real numbers. So what is a complex number? A complex number is any number that you can write in this form. So we have two parts here. A is what we call the real part, and BI is called the imaginary part. And A and B can be any real number. So what can they look like? You can have a number that's 3 minus 4i. You have a real part and the imaginary part. You can have numbers that are going to be like that when the real part is 0 and the imaginary part is what you have there. These numbers are called pure imaginary. And then you also have numbers, sometimes people don't realize that, but number 17, which is a real number, is actually also a complex number. This is a number where the imaginary part will be 0, which means b is 0, and we call these numbers pure real. So in general, when we say complex numbers, they actually include real numbers in them. Alright, so let's take a look at a few more problems. So how do you work with expressions like this? So you have 3 plus square root of -196. I think if you remember what we did just a couple of minutes ago, you should realize that 3 is going to stay there. Then we're going to deal with this. So what can we do with the square root of -196? We are going to do the same thing. 196 times -1, and I can split it up at the same time. So this is 14, this is I. So that's for the square root of -196, and we still have 3. So the answer is going to be 3 plus 14i. And that's the answer. Simplify -5 minus square root of -24. Okay, So let's deal with the square root of negative 24 first. I think you can all see that I can do that. As a matter of fact, you don't even have to write this. Just every time you see a square root of a negative number, you should just write I there and get rid of the negative. Okay. But the square root of 24, 24 is not a perfect square, although I can simplify that as 2 square root of 6. And then you're going to have I. So as I already mentioned earlier, I needs to go in front of the square root of 6. So we are going to write this part here as 2i square root of 6. This is just a traditional way of writing that. So that is this, square root of negative 24. So the whole thing will be written as negative 5 minus 2i square root of 6. And our last problem, I don't know why they're all numbered example 4. This should be example 5, this should be example 6. So 3 plus square root of negative 19. I'm not gonna run through the whole thing. I'm just gonna tell you that 19 is not a perfect square, more so it's prime. But the fact that you have a square root of negative number means there will be I in it. So this part here is I square root of 19. And our answer will be 3 minus I square root of 19. And that is the answer. So I hope you can see it's not really a hard thing to do. Alright, see you next time.